gives me very great pleasure to welcome Dr. Hedy Viterbo, who's a senior lecturer in law at Queen Mary University of London. And he was previously lecturer in law at the University of Essex and also a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at SOAS, and has also been a visiting scholar at Harvard Law School and a visiting researcher at Columbia University as well. So his research is very important. It examines legal issues concerning childhood, state violence and sexuality from a interdisciplinary and global perspective. And his latest book is Problematizing Law, Rights and Childhood in Israel, Palestine, published by Cambridge University Press. So the title of this talk this evening is Just for Kids, How the Youth Decarceration Discourse Legitimizes Adult Incarceration, which is a very contemporary theme, a challenging theme too, because so often when we look at youth justice systems, we think that they are benign, but they have all sorts of problematic consequences. So Hedy is going to talk for 45 minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity for conversation, Q&A. So if you do have questions or comments, please do put them in the Q&A, and we'll check, as well as the people here offering comments, we will check the comments later. So Hedy, thank you very much indeed for being willing to talk to us this evening, and I will now hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. Thanks for having me this evening. I'm assuming and hoping you can still see my slides, but please let me know if you can't. I'll just mention that this talk is based on a forthcoming article, but I'm still finalizing the manuscript, so any comments are really very warmly welcome. Basically what I'll do, I'll start by clarifying some of the terminology that I'll be using today. Then I'll say a bit about the sources that I am examining, as well as my methodology. And from there, I'll delve into each of my main arguments. In the interest of clarity, I'd like to start by explaining the phrase youth decarceration, which is central to my talk. And I'll say a few words about each of these terms, decarceration and youth. So let's start with decarceration. There are different definitions of this term, but I, like many other scholars, define it as an umbrella concept, which encompasses a range of models with a common aim of either decreasing or abolishing incarceration. These models include diversion, decriminalization, and abolition, among other things. Now to the term youth. I avoid using the term children for various reasons. One reason is that most countries exempt preteens and toddlers from incarceration. As a result, the young people in question are actually a much narrower age group. Usually they're teenagers. So as you can see, the phrase youth decarceration refers to the view that the incarceration of youth should be minimized or even abolished. And in this talk, I'll be critically examining publications that advocate youth decarceration. And this includes publications by academics, human rights organizations, and state officials. Youth decarceration, both as a discourse and praxis, is not new at all. But my focus will be on this rhetoric in the last 2 decades, relating primarily to the UK and the US. And the publications under examination promote a broad range of youth decarceration models. Some categorically advocate abolishing youth imprisonment. Others believe that a minority of youth do belong behind bars, especially those who've been convicted of grave crimes and are deemed a serious threat to society. The proposed alternatives to prison also vary. Some advocates of youth decarceration espouse restorative justice alternative, which I know is a topic that your very own Heather Strang has written extensively about. Others suggest therapeutic options. There are also different recommendations for decriminalization. Some call for all unlawful behavior by youth to be decriminalized. Others propose to specifically abolish status offenses, such as truancy and running away from home, which are illegal only if committed by a person under the age of majority. Notwithstanding this disparity, most advocates of youth decarceration share a common characteristic. It's a pitfall of the youth decarceration rhetoric that has so far been overlooked. And this evening, I hope to bring it to light. As I'll show, this discourse, despite its anti-carceral veneer, persistently lends legitimacy to the incarceration of adults in trouble with the law. It does so by portraying them as incorrigible, blameworthy, and therefore as deserving punishment and incarceration. We know that in England and Wales, more than 99% of the prison population is aged 18 years or older. And in the US, the figure is more than 98%. So when it comes to the overwhelming majority of imprisoned people, the dominant discourse of youth decarceration condones carceral thinking and potentially even entrenches it. My argument today is different from previous critiques by other scholars. For decades, youth decarceration initiatives have been criticized for their detrimental impact on the young people they claim to serve. Critics have shown how these initiatives often replicate within the community the modes and logic of control that they claim to replace. And in addition, they increase the number of young people and families under surveillance, and they also expand the powers of the penal system. Another line of criticism has been that youth from racialized minority groups are less likely to be diverted from the prison system than their white counterparts, especially in the US. These criticisms are highly valuable, but my argument is different in two respects. First of all, my focus isn't on youth. Instead, I turn the spotlight elsewhere, to the potentially negative implications for adults in conflict with the law. In some of my previous work, I've repeatedly argued that policies and discourses that appear to be focused on children are often actually concerned, or equally concerned rather, with adults. And these adults aren't just those who are related to or responsible for the children concerned, such as parents, teachers, and social workers. They also include other adults, such as imprisoned people, who are the focus of my talk today. The second difference from previous critiques is that I'm not making any argument about the impact of youth decarceration initiatives. Instead, I'm providing a critical discourse analysis. So my aim is to unmask a rhetoric that seems to oppose incarceration by revealing how it actually lends legitimacy to the incarceration of the vast majority of people behind bars. My second argument is that those who push for youth decarceration often disregard the vulnerability of adults. And I'll focus on a particular context which throws this problem into sharp relief, and that is the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. Specifically, I'll show how proponents of youth decarceration have called for young people to be prioritized for release from prisons, despite the uncontested fact that older people are actually more medically vulnerable to COVID-19. My third argument is that the claims made in support of youth decarceration suffer from age essentialism, and I'll explain this term later. But basically, my focus will be on assumptions that are often made about differences between youth and adults. The prevailing assumption is that these differences are natural and self-evident. But I'll explain why this assumption is ageist, why it relies on questionable science, and why age differences are much more socially constructed than we're usually led to believe. Lastly, I'll argue that the problems I'm pointing to are not unique to the context of decarceration. They're a symptom of broader pitfalls of the child rights framework. I'll illustrate this point through examples from some other contexts. And just to clarify, I'm not calling for children to be denied rights. On the contrary, my argument is that the dominant framework of child rights fails to properly empower and protect those it claims to serve. If anything, the young people we define as children deserve more empowerment and better protection. Before I continue, I should clarify that my criticism is not a criticism of decarceration. Quite the opposite. There are compelling reasons to support decarceration. My argument is simply that we need to challenge both carceral thinking and ageism. And in order to do that, we need a bolder decarceration vision, which would benefit people across the age spectrum. So my focus isn't on whether or why decarceration is justified. But for those who are less familiar with this topic, let me briefly mention some key problems concerning incarceration. Obviously, imprisonment is not a one-dimensional experience. Some people may even experience certain aspects of it as positive, and I know that your very own Ben Crew and Alice Levins have written about this. But there are also undeniable problems. They don't exist in all prisons, certainly not to the same extent, but they have been reported to exist in prisons across many, if not most parts of the world. One issue is the disproportionate incarceration of people from marginalized, disadvantaged, and disempowered groups. Another issue concerns the prison conditions. These sometimes include the lack of proper care, underqualified and overstretched staff, prevalent racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia, and cultures of violence and fear. Yet another problem is the failure of imprisonment and punishment to achieve their stated objectives, both in terms of sufficiently reducing crime and meeting the needs of victims. There's also the fact that many people are held beyond bars for non-violent offenses or even for technical violations of their parole or probation conditions. And on top of all of this, prosecution and incarceration come at an immense financial cost. And this money could have benefited other social avenues, such as anti-poverty initiatives, community empowerment programs, affordable housing, welfare services, better quality healthcare and education, and recreational projects. Some advocates of youth decarceration have mentioned these issues, but they've repeatedly associated them primarily, if not exclusively, with youth. And this gives the wrong impression that imprisoned adults are somehow less exposed to these problems. And against this backdrop, let's have a look at the following remark, which was made by a prison reform campaigner who works for an advocacy charity in the US called the Prison Policy Initiative. She notes, and I quote, "The efforts to reverse mass incarceration for adults and to deinstitutionalize justice-involved youth have remained curiously distinct. But the two systems have more problems in common than one might think," end quote. But I wouldn't characterize youth decarceration advocacy as curiously distinct from other decarceration campaigns. Actually, there's nothing curious about its distinctness. As I'll now show, proponents of youth decarceration not only detach their claims from those of broader decarceration efforts, what they also do is potentially undermine these broader efforts by lending legitimacy to the incarceration of adults. And there are different ways in which advocates of youth decarceration legitimize adult incarceration. Some are implicit and others more explicit. Let's start with some representative examples of implicit legitimation. One example is the call for youth in conflict with the law to be treated as children, not offenders. A similar example is the claim that they should be viewed as children first, offenders second. Another example is the depiction of childhood and prison as two mutually exclusive realms. Some advocates of youth decarceration argue that, and I quote, children do not belong in prison. Others say that, and here's another quote, prison is not a place for children. There are those who claim that imprisonment deprives youth not only of their liberty, but also of their childhood. And one last example of implicit legitimation for adult incarceration is the call to decarcerate youth because they're, and I quote, the future of our nation. So even though this rhetoric uses the words children and youth, it also has implications for adults. After all, if prison is not a place for children, then whom is it for? If youth are the future, then whose potential is less valuable? If children are not offenders, then who does deserve to be labeled an offender? If youth in conflict with the law are children first, offenders second, then whose offending is not secondary? Is incarceration any less deplorable when those affected by it are deemed too old to be denied their childhood? So the answer to all of these questions is one and the same. The rhetoric of youth decarceration is premised on the belief that adults are less deserving of mercy. After all, if they too had been depicted as adults, not offenders, or as adults first, offenders second, or as belonging outside prison, or as society's future, or as having their adulthood denied by incarceration, then singling out youth would have neither made sense nor be necessary. Youth decarceration could then have been replaced by a bolder decarceration vision, one that views everyone in trouble with the law, regardless of their age, as people, not offenders. Now, occasionally, proponents of youth decarceration are more explicit in calling for adults to be denied leniency. There are many examples of this, but I'll focus on two representative ones. The first example is the following assertion, and I quote, adults are responsible for making their own decisions in life and for bearing the consequences of their decision-making. Adults are responsible for decisions where children are not. Youth should be spared sentences that resemble those handed down to adults. Broadly, fines, community service, community supervision, and imprisonment. End quote. So in other words, incarceration and punitiveness are presented as perfectly legitimate as long as they're targeted at adults. The second example is found in a policy paper written by several charity workers and academics in the US. They quote a judgment by the US Supreme Court, according to which, and I quote, a child's character is not as well formed as an adult's. His traits are less fixed and his actions less likely to be evidence of irretrievable depravity, end quote. So in other words, adults in trouble with the law are expected to be irretrievably depraved, and they should be punished accordingly. So as you can see so far, the youth decarceration discourse doesn't actually challenge carceral thinking. On the contrary, it repeatedly describes adults in trouble with the law as incorrigible, culpable, and as deserving punishment, including incarceration. In addition, this discourse also feeds into the punitive fixation with blame. By this, I'm referring to the fixation with dividing people into those who are blameworthy and those who are deemed less so. But the youth decarceration discourse suffers from another pitfall. It ignores and even minimizes adult vulnerability. A growing literature has called into question dominant assumptions about vulnerability. Some scholars, such as Martha Feynman, emphasize the centrality of vulnerability to human subjectivity. Others, such as Jonathan Herring, argue that not only children, but also adults are inherently and existentially vulnerable. In the field of childhood studies, numerous scholars, such as Pia Christensen, have shown how childhood vulnerability is to a large extent socially constructed. So against this backdrop, it becomes clear that young age doesn't neatly correlate with vulnerability. This fact is not often sufficiently acknowledged, but there is one context where it is virtually undisputed, and that's the coronavirus pandemic. Since the early stages of the pandemic, it became common knowledge that the youngest members of society were generally the least medically vulnerable to COVID-19. In contrast, older age is one of the strongest predictors of mortality from the disease. This has clear implications for prison populations. As you all are probably aware, prisons around the world have been hotbeds of infection. They're often overcrowded, unsanitary, poorly ventilated, and with substandard healthcare. Their population has high rates of pre-existing medical conditions, and as such is especially vulnerable to COVID. There have been some attempts to enforce social distancing in prisons without reducing crowding, but these attempts have proven unfeasible, and they've also infringed on the basic rights of those behind bars, as well as increasing their risk of suffering violence and self-harm. As a result, during the first year of the pandemic, around the world, hundreds of thousands of people were released from prisons. Add to this the fact that the average age of those behind bars in many parts of the world is increasingly higher than that of the general public. This is why many of the countries that pursued decarceration during the pandemic included older age among the release criteria. The mass decarceration that took place in many countries during the pandemic posed a unique opportunity for those who oppose incarceration. It offered an opportunity to decarcerate people of all ages. But some human rights organizations argued that youth were those who should be singled out or even prioritized for release from prisons. This argument blatantly ignored the fact that adults were more medically vulnerable to COVID, especially behind bars. Here are some examples. A publication by UNICEF, which was endorsed by 14 NGOs and 4 UN bodies, called, and I quote, for the prioritizing of children for immediate release. And it added, public authorities should exercise their detention powers cautiously, considering the heightened vulnerability of the child, particularly in the current context of COVID-19. States should prioritize the diversion of children away from formal justice processes. Other organizations which are not focused on children's rights also promoted a similar approach. An example is a forum of UN and other humanitarian organizations called the Interagency Standing Committee. It argued, and I quote, that detention, even as a last resort, is never in the best interest of a child. Thus, non-custodial alternatives to detention should be favored for any person under 18 years, especially in the context of COVID-19. This language left open the possibility that for adults, incarceration is somehow justifiable even during the pandemic. One NGO went even further. It argued that releasing incarcerated minors, and I quote, while halting the arrests and new incarceration of other minors can significantly reduce the overcrowding in prisons and the risk to all incarcerated people with minimum risk to society, end quote. The argument that youth decarceration poses minimum risk to society seems to suggest that adults behind bars are a greater danger. The implication is that the continued incarceration of adults is necessary to minimize the risk to the public. This type of risk prevention rhetoric has rightly been criticized by various scholars in many contexts, but it's flawed even on its own terms, because studies across different countries, such as those conducted by Steffensheimer and others, have proven beyond doubt that there's no inherent correlation between age and the likelihood to offend. So as we've seen, proponents of youth decarceration promote a hierarchy of deservingness. Specifically, they cast youth as more deserving of decarceration than adults. The arguments they make in defense of this hierarchy suffer from what I have previously called age essentialism. As many of you probably know, essentialism can be defined roughly as the belief that a type of person or thing has a true, intrinsic, constitutive, and invariant nature. Essentialism comes in different shapes and forms. In the case of youth decarceration, what we're seeing is age essentialism. This is the widely held but problematic belief in the existence of naturally and universally distinct age groups with inherently unique characteristics and needs. Although we normally associate ageism with older age, in fact, what we're seeing here is ageism towards young and adult people alike. Age essentialism boxes people into the rigid binary of either child or adult, and in that sense, it's ageist towards everyone. Proponents of youth decarceration make all sorts of essentialist claims. One common claim is that youth are naturally impulsive, reckless, prone to irrationality, and susceptible to negative social influences. These traits are then attributed, at least partly, to the alleged psychological and neurological immaturity of these young people. These claims are not only ageist, they also rely on very questionable science. Developmental psychology specifically has been subject to growing academic criticism from scholars such as Erica Berman, John Morse, and Wendy Staten-Rogers. As they argue, developmental psychology is a reductive enterprise of creating rational subjects that are amenable to existing socioeconomic power relations. Neurodevelopmental studies have also been roundly criticized by scholars such as Judith Basant, Peter Kelly, and Alexandra Cox. As they argue, studies of adolescent brain development make contested and constantly changing assumptions about brain activity. These studies also ignore countless variables that may influence the brain. They also generalize based on participants from particular social backgrounds. Their brain maps are oversimplified for media and statistical purposes. And in addition, testing in a lab setting is inevitably limited. Beyond all of that, human development has been shown to be heavily affected by social stimuli. And it's only in modern times that these social stimuli have been highly regimented by a person's age. So today, experiences and knowledge that are deemed age inappropriate are withheld from many young people well into their teens, if not beyond. So it's no wonder that they appear to be less developed. In fact, all of this is also borne out by historical and anthropological studies of childhood. As these studies show, many of the current differences between those we now call children and those we call adults are quite a recent development. In earlier societies, these differences either didn't exist or were much less pronounced. This is because the youngest members of society would mix freely with their elders in the public sphere, they would perform similar work, and they would absorb similar information. Until well into the 19th century, a person's date of birth was rarely known, celebrated, or accurately recorded, and this is still true for hundreds of millions of people around the world. A person's status changed gradually or through rites of passage rather than on the basis of their age. In addition, until recent times, legislation based on age was rare and was mostly unenforced. When people behind bars started being separated, it wasn't by their age. Instead, they were separated by their perceived character, the severity of their offense, and whether they had prior criminal record. There were also no laws requiring universal compulsory education. And in the schools that did exist, each classroom would have students across a very broad age range. We can also gain relevant insights from anthropology. As I've mentioned, advocates of youth decarceration have a very culturally specific notion of adolescence. They assume that it's an innately turbulent period of time, a period of life, sorry. But as anthropological studies have long shown, some societies have had none of this adolescent unrest. What this suggests is that age differences might diminish significantly if we were to dismantle the institutions and attitudes that perpetrate and amplify these differences. And this includes the rhetoric of youth decarceration, which doesn't simply reflect a natural and universal childhood, but rather enforces and reinforces a certain model of childhood, which is ageist, culturally and historically specific, and also reliant, as I've shown, on questionable science. Advocates of youth decarceration also often invoke child rights. Some of them explicitly present their vision as grounded in the child rights movement. Others emphasize the need to prioritize the best interests of children and to recognize their special rights. Often, those who push for youth decarceration also cite international law relating to child rights. One of the most commonly cited documents is the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is also the most widely ratified treaty in the world. According to Article 37b of the Convention, and I quote, "The arrest, detention, or imprisonment of a child shall be used only as a measure of last resort." end quote. This principle is reiterated in several resolutions of the UN General Assembly on youth justice, which are also often cited by proponents of youth decarceration. But international law doesn't afford this leniency to adults. The closest provision, which applies to people of all ages, is found in the 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. But all that it does is prohibit arresting or locking up a person arbitrarily or without due process. Similarly, since the invention of the youth justice system as a discrete legal realm in the 19th century, it has enabled adults to be held to excessively idealized standards of criminal responsibility. And in this way, the law, including child rights law, reserves special protection exclusively for the young. And in so doing, it paves the way for the continued incarceration of adults. This pitfall is not unique to the carceral context. There are various other settings in which the child rights discourse denies leniency and compassion to those it defines as adults. For example, Akila Anand has researched some reforms to family courts in the US, and she found that attempts to redesign these courts in a so-called child-sensitive way have actually depicted the adults who are brought before the court as culpable criminals who need to be sent to prison. Erica Berman has written about how humanitarian aid campaigns tend to privilege children and how this casts adults as less worthy of assistance and empathy. Another case in point is armed conflict in two respects. First, in my own research on Israel-Palestine, I've shown how Israel doesn't simply disregard international legal norms, nor does it ignore child rights standards. Instead, Israeli authorities have been pursuing a more sophisticated course of action. They have increasingly used the language of children's rights and international law as tools for oppressing, governing, and disciplining Palestinian adults, including those who are held in Israeli prisons. I know some members of staff in the Institute have written on education in prison, and one of the issues my research has looked at is both academic and informal studies of Palestinian adults behind bars and the way in which Israel has increasingly clamped down on these studies within this context. Another issue has been pointed out by Charlie Carpenter in her study of how international bodies protect civilians in conflict zones. As she argues, the conflation of both children and women with innocent and vulnerable civilians harms men of legal age. It overlooks civilian men who are not combatants. It disregards the higher exposure of men to certain forms of state violence, and it even facilitates the indiscriminate targeting of men by the warring parties. So against this backdrop, it becomes evident that the problems I have identified are not entirely unique to the rhetoric of youth decarceration. Instead, they're a symptom of a broader pitfall of the children's rights framework. And in fact, the dominant discourse of child rights sometimes harms not only adults, but also those it defines as children. Earlier, I mentioned how youth decarceration has been criticized for replicating and expanding the modes of control that it claims to replace. But there are other contexts in which the discourse of child rights harms children. For example, in a recent publication, I highlighted some of the unintended consequences of the separation of children and adults in prisons. As I've shown, many of these children have been needlessly subjected to solitary confinement simply because this was seen as necessary for keeping them separate from adults. In other publications, I've shown how children under colonial or military rule have been systematically removed from their older counterparts and exposed to great harm, and how this was then presented as a protective measure. Another example has to do with working children. Many scholars, some of whom are mentioned on the slide, have sharply criticized policies that aim to abolish child labor. As these scholars show, these policies often end up pushing children into more hazardous and exploitative work. Meanwhile, what gets ignored is the voices and wishes of these children themselves, who often view their work as beneficial or necessary. Similarly, other scholars, such as Aoife Daly and Laura Lundy, have critically examined the so-called right of the child to be heard. And I know this is also a topic that your very own Caroline Lansky has written about from a different angle. As critics have argued, the right to be heard is framed extremely vaguely in both international and national laws. And as a result, judges, teachers, and other adults are effectively allowed to disregard children's views if they're different from their own views. These are just a few representative examples. I'm happy to elaborate about them later if anyone has questions, but hopefully they give you a sense of the point. What we see is that the youth decarceration discourse epitomizes two broader pitfalls of child rights. On the one hand, they legitimize harm and apathy to adults. On the other hand, they repeatedly harm children, and they also disregard their views. As I emphasized earlier, my point here isn't that children should be denied rights or protection. On the contrary, I'm arguing that both children and adults deserve better protection and more equitable treatment. In that sense, the dominant child rights framework does a disservice to people of all ages, even if this is often done with the best of intentions. To conclude, let's shift the focus back to youth decarceration. As you've seen, I avoid speculating on why proponents of youth decarceration make the sort of arguments that they make. In previous research, I've explained the analytical, epistemological, and normative problems with explanations that are based on intentions. And I'm happy to elaborate on this later if anyone is interested. But for the sake of argument, let's consider the possibility that advocates of youth decarceration are strategically legitimizing adult punishment. In other words, let's consider the option that they are being strategic in using the sort of arguments that I'm criticizing. The problem is that even from a purely strategic perspective, if such a thing even exists, advocating youth decarceration by legitimizing adult punishment is questionable in two respects. First, as I've mentioned, scholars have brought to light the harmful impact of youth decarceration on the young people it seeks to serve. Second, there's no reason to assume that a decline in youth incarceration would necessarily be accompanied by a decline in incarceration more broadly. Take, for example, the case of Canada. Over the past 2 decades, the youth incarceration rate there has dropped by a staggering 73%. But the adult incarceration rate has remained virtually unchanged. Similarly, in the UK, youth incarceration shrunk both in the 1980s and throughout most of the past 2 decades. But the adult incarceration rate remained fairly stable during these periods. Given the fact that supporters of youth decarceration legitimize adult incarceration, a reduction in youth incarceration can actually be accompanied by an increase in adult incarceration. And an example of this is local jails in the US. The youth population there nearly halved between 2005 and 2017, but the number of adults behind bars actually increased. This indicates that the youth decarceration rhetoric is not only ageist. Even from a strategic perspective, this rhetoric can lead to undesirable results. So I'll stop here, and I greatly welcome any comments and questions, and thank you very much for listening.